All right, so breaking the chain, the effects of high density altitude. Tonight, we'll take a look at our agenda. We'll discuss what the WINGS program is. We'll have some introductions. We'll talk about what we're trying to accomplish with the Breaking the Chain program and how we accomplish it. We'll have the main presentation from our guest presenter tonight. We'll have an open forum of question and answers. Then we'll have some closing comments. I'll also talk about how to obtain WINGS credit. Now, very, very important, I'll say up front, a lot of you guys that participate on a regular basis participate and you don't send me a note to claim your WINGS credit. I want to make sure that everyone who is participating in these programs are getting the WINGS credit they deserve and earn from these. So pay very close attention to the instructions and make sure to follow them. I will send them out. Send out the instructions over the chat as well, but I'm going to tell you in a moment how we can get WINGS credit. All right, so if any of you guys have any comments or recommendations for how to improve this program, I am a lead fast team member in the San Antonio Flight Standards District Office, or FSDO for short. My program manager is Mr. Ryan Newman, and that's his email. If you would like to send him a note and let him know how I'm doing or what we can do to try to improve this program, by all means, please do so. You can also let me know as well, and I'll try to take in any kind of consideration with future projects. Again, this is an FAA safety team program webinar tonight. That being said, what is WINGS credit? And why do I care? Well, to obtain WINGS credit, go to the FAAsafety.gov URL that you see there, create a profile, and based off of your geographical location, you will obtain announcements for seminars and webinars throughout your area. And if you apply to participate in these WINGS programs, you can obtain WINGS credit, and there's different levels that you can navigate up towards getting a flight review. And also WINGS credit can potentially help you reduce your insurance premiums. And also, if there is ever, unfortunately, an incident or an accident or a situation where you have a bad day with the FAA or something of that nature, your records will reflect that you've been participating in these WINGS events, and it looks good to have it on your record. So check it out and become a WINGS participant. My name is Jeremy Walters. I am an airline transport pilot by profession, airplane, and working on helicopters. I am a Gold Seal flight instructor. That is my true passion in aviation, is to teach and be a mentor and inspire. And I'm a major in the United States Army Reserves. I spent 10 years on active duty, and I flew the Apache helicopter in combat in Afghanistan and here in the States. I've also done some other things to support the Department of Defense and some other aircraft as well. And I'm the lead fast team representative in the San Antonio FSDO. I also have a YouTube channel called All American Aviation, where I promote aviation safety, education, and adventure, and try to inspire folks to do the right thing. What I'm trying to accomplish overall is to foster and promote a aviation safety conscious environment. Now, that being said, some of you guys received a message that I'm going to make two announcements tonight. I'm going to make one announcement for our next presenter later in the presentation towards the end after Dayton is through. But the first announcement I would like to make is the fourth scope of my mission called All American Aviation. I have announced in the past that I have three scopes. One is the flight instruct. Two is to partake in webinars and seminars and get pilots together and talk safety, education, promote flying, and all that sort of stuff. The third scope is the YouTube channel. the force scope. The force scope, this is the first time I've publicly announced this, but I am beginning drafting an outline to release a book. I am in the process of drafting a book, and it will be released sometime in the future. I'm not going to comment on when that's going to happen, but the process of becoming an instructor, doing these webinars, building the YouTube channel has been an adventure in itself. And I'm sure drafting and writing a book for release is going to be the same. So this is the first time I've publicly announced it. Now that I've done it, I have no choice but to fulfill my obligation. It's something that I feel that I deeply want to do, and I'm going to plan on releasing a book related to this particular project, Breaking the Chain, in the future. And there will probably be some other books later on down the road as well. So I just wanted to make that announcement. I could not do these webinars without an excellent assistant. And I have one, Mr. Paul Nadeau. Paul has been very loyal and helpful. He is my technical guru. He helps me push these programs out. He also helps facilitate. Paul is an instrument-rated private pilot. He participates in Angel flights, and he is a United States Navy veteran from Desert Storm. Paul is a big help and asset to this program. What are we trying to accomplish? Many of you have heard that there is an error chain that leads from the receipt of the mission to an incident or an accident. The errors can be fatigue, it can be malnourishment, it could be the use of alcohol, it could be a number of things. There's too many errors that can be listed. However, what we do know is that any incident or an accident, there's a chain of events in the human factors realm that lead to the incident. So what we're trying to do is start from a good flight that turns bad, break up that chain of events by cracking one of the links in the chain with the end state of preventing the accident from occurring. That is what breaking the chain is all about. It is not a reactive process, it is a proactive process. And how do we execute? We do so by research, planning, training, being self-aware, and maintaining a breaking the chain mindset. Tonight, we'll have guest speaker Dayton Dabbs. Dayton is a gyroplane CFI and designated pilot examiner that's based out of Taylor, Texas. Dayton also is an airplane pilot. He owns a Mooney, and he's an aircraft builder. He's also a Magni M16 dealer, and Dayton has actually set quite a few records. And I'm not going to steal Dayton's thunder tonight. I'm going to let him tell you all about what he does and how awesome gyroplanes are, and talk a little bit about the effects of high density altitude operations. So without further ado, Dayton, you now have the flight controls. I'm going to stop sharing. You have the floor.
All righty, I've got it. Thanks, guys. And thank you, Jeremy, for bringing me here. One thing Jeremy forgot to say in all of his qualifications is that he is rated in the gyroplane as well, and will hopefully get his CFI in that one day as well. So, as Jeremy said, my name's Dayton Dabbs. I'm a flight instructor and pilot examiner in Taylor, Texas. Before we get started, if y'all have any questions at any time, please type them in the chat box. If I'm not able to get to them today, then my phone number and my email address are on the bottom of my screen here. My slideshow is going to be, I've got it in PDF format, so I'm sorry that it's not going to be a real smooth transition in between slides. But if any of y'all want a copy of anything that I've got, please feel free to contact me. So when Jeremy first reached out and asked me to be a guest speaker for this series, we got to talking about all the different subjects that could be taught on breaking the chain. As a gyroplane pilot, instructor, and examiner, there's a ton of information that I have that may not really be that relevant to a lot of y'all, because I know a lot of you are coming from the fixed wing world. So if you do have any questions, again, feel free to raise your hand, ask as we go along. But after putting some thoughts together, we decided that a lesson on, or not lesson, but a seminar on high density altitude flying would be the best topic that's both relevant to the aviation community as a whole, and that I personally have, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, gained some real world experience in. So before I begin, would y'all type in the chat box just what your aviation experience level is, just so I know basically who is in this or who my audience is today? Let's see what we got. All right, so we're already from student pilot beginning to sounds like military pilot, CFIIs. Okay. Awesome. We've got, okay, just about every type in the book, it sounds like. And all right, awesome. Well, there's quite a large range, just as I expected for everybody that's in here. So with a crowd that's such diverse in their aviation backgrounds, a lot of what I cover, it may be very elementary, some of you, and a lot of what I cover to others may seem a bit overwhelming depending on your level of experience. So again, I welcome any questions along the way, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. So my schedule that I have planned for today is to start with some basic information on what density altitude is. I plan on following that up with how it got me into trouble one day. I'll follow that up by how it can get you into trouble. And then I'll talk about how to avoid it, and then talk about how my mistakes led to some of my greatest successes in aviation, including setting 3 world records in gyroplanes with the help of some of my friends. So I'll let you know of some wonderful resources that are out there also, even if your flight manual's information is weak. And then I'll make time for some questions. So without further ado, let's get started. So next question I have for all of y'all is, I would like to hear from some of you how you would describe density altitude. For any of you that have experience, how would you describe it? So I'll wait while I'm waiting for that in the chat. As you can see on my slide here, FAA publication, this FAA publication that's written FAA-P as in Papa -8740-2. That is a short 4-page read that the FAA's published that could potentially save your life on density altitude. It explains how the FAA describes density altitude, and as well as how you can work through it. So I've got the altitude at which your engine thinks you are performing, the altitude the airplane, engine, prop, and pilot feels, performance humidity, altitude corrected for temperature and pressure, the molecular density of the atmosphere based on temperature. All of these are correct. All these are absolutely correct. So the way I describe it to my students is the way a lot of you are describing it to me as well. The FAA describes it as pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature and pressure, or I'm sorry, correction. Pressure altitude corrected for non-standard temperature. That's the FAA definition. But what does that really mean? The easiest way that I describe it, and the way I explain it to my students, is that density altitude is the altitude the aircraft will act like it's flying at, even though you are flying at a different altitude. So the reason why the aircraft will fly or will act like it's flying at this altitude is because the air is either thicker or thinner depending on the temperature, pressure, and humidity. This is a question I ask a lot of my students on flight exams, is what goes into density altitude? And everyone can pretty much tell you temperature, and then they'll tell you altitude. But then a lot of times people forget humidity, and they also forget about pressure, because the reality is altitude and pressure kind of go hand in hand. So that's something to think about as well. So in order to compare the thickness of the air today as opposed to a standard day, we have to establish a baseline for temperature, pressure, and humidity on a standard day. So can anyone here tell me what standard temperature, pressure, and humidity are? (15°C, 29.92). Jim gets the gold star for coming in first. So absolutely correct. So 15 degrees Celsius, 29.92, but I haven't heard yet, or no one's typed out yet, what standard humidity is. Here's the answer. Standard humidity, when the books are written, humidity is assumed to be 0%. So it's assumed that it's a dry day. So this is something to absolutely take into consideration when that time comes, and we'll follow that, or I'll follow that up with a little bit more of an explanation here in just a moment. So let's define a couple of different altitude definitions. So I agree with that, Matt. So let's define a couple different altitude definitions. So I want to start with indicated altitude. So for those of you that have been flying at all that are not brand new to it, you know that you have to set your altimeter for a certain pressure reading of that day, and that will give you your indicated altitude. That's going to be what shows up on your altimeter. So most of the time, well, for the most part, that is going to be your altitude above sea level, or your height above sea level. So that's your indicated altitude. Now, very rarely, we mentioned that 29.92 inches of mercury is your standard pressure. So very rarely is the day actually 29.92 inches of mercury. So we have to adjust that altitude or adjust our indicated altitude for non-standard pressure to give us pressure altitude. We then take pressure altitude and get non-standard temperature. So the 15 degrees C that was mentioned earlier, that's also 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Now in Texas, it's very, very rare that we have 50. That's probably a cold day in the middle of December that we're receiving 59 degree Fahrenheit. So most of the time, and at least in Texas where I live, I know we probably got a lot of people from the north. 59 degrees is going to be much lower than what our actual temperature is. So we have to adjust for non-standard temperature in order to receive density altitude. So the effects of pressure, temperature, and humidity. So basically, low pressure is going to provide poorer performance. High temperature is going to provide poorer performance, and high humidity is going to provide poorer performance. So pressure altitude increases approximately 10 feet for each 100th of an inch of mercury less than 29.92 inches of mercury. Density altitude increases approximately 120 feet for every 1 degree above 15 degrees C. And then humidity is typically, as I mentioned earlier, humidity is typically not calculated into density altitude calculations, although it is recommended to add 10%, according to the FAA document. It's recommended to add 10% to the takeoff distance in high humidity. And this is because, again, humid air is not as dense as dry air. So I wanted to give a bit of an example to give y'all a way we can calculate density altitude. So as I planned this seminar, the weather at Taylor was as shown on this METAR. Now, on the 24th, it was at 16:15 Zulu, automated weather observation, wind 050 at 5 knots, visibility 10 statute miles, sky clear, temperature tree 2, dew point 20, altimeter tree 004. So the temperature of 32 degrees C is clearly higher than the standard temperature of 15 degrees C, which is going to degrade performance. and the pressure of 30.04 inches of mercury is higher than standard pressure of 29.92 inches of mercury, which will improve performance. So in Taylor, if you listen to the AWOS, it will end with what your density altitude actually is. So on the day of this METAR, at the time of this METAR, the density altitude provided by the AWOS was reported as 2,600 feet. What this means is that even though we're flying out of Taylor, which has a field elevation of 600 feet above sea level, the plane is going to act like it's taking off out of 2,600 feet on a standard day. So let's talk about how density altitude got me into trouble. So these couple slides, I'm sorry if they're kind of hard to see, but this is a sectional for Taylor, Texas. So I'm going to pick up on a day that I wouldn't exactly consider the highlight of my aviation career. I'm what many pilots would refer to as a flatlander. As you can see on this sectional, it's very, very flat land. I was born and raised in Central Texas, and almost all of my aviation career up until September of 2013 was over flat terrain. So, like many pilots, I could tell you how to calculate performance on the day of my practical exam. But if I'm being honest with you, I was of the mindset that I would always be flying out of airfields that were plenty long. I would always keep it within weight and balance. So in my mind, I didn't have to go through all those calculations on a regular basis. It was almost just a lesson in futility. So this bit me one day in September of 2013 when I was on a training flight in Erie, Colorado in a high density altitude environment. As you can see from this slide, this is all around Erie, Colorado. It is not lowland terrain. It is not flat terrain. So I was invited into the Denver area to train a student in his gyroplane. The particular gyro was turbocharged and it had a constant speed prop. So for those that are listening that are relatively new to aviation, turbochargers and superchargers are particularly beneficial at high altitudes because a turbocharger or a supercharger compresses air going into the engine. So getting a note that some people might be a little bit behind on the slides. I apologize about that. Let me see. Jeremy or Paul, are y'all showing the density altitude around, or the sectional on Colorado?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm seeing the sectional for like Denver, I think.
Yep, that's it. Excellent.
That's
okay.
Where I'm at as well.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thanks, guys. So the particular gyro I was flying was turbocharged and it had a constant speed prop. So a turbocharger, all it is a compressor that compresses air going into your engine. So it takes away some of the effects of density altitude because basically it makes the air going into your engine act as if it's still at sea level. So the particular gyroplane I was flying, it was of the same make and model as one that had set an altitude record at 24,000 feet just 2 years prior. And so, yes, gyroplanes do go up as high as 24,000 feet. So I was pretty comfortable with the fact that the aircraft had the performance to fly out of Erie, although I knew that I would have degraded performance over what I flew at Taylor. So let's talk just a quick bit about the regulations and what they require based on aircraft performance. This is a good time to remind everybody that the FARs, specifically 14 CFR Part 91-103, requires that each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. This information must include runway lengths at airports of intended use and the following takeoff and landing distance information. So you have to have the takeoff and landing information from the airplane or rotorcraft flight manual, or if that information is not available, you have to have some other reliable information that will show you that information or give you that data based on elevation, runway slope, aircraft gross weight, and wind and temperature. So I have had a couple of friends that have actually had issues in their airplanes on takeoff where they ended up in an accident at the end of the runway, and the FAA came and they did bite them based on this FAR. So something to keep in mind that if you ever really do have an action or have an accident, this is something that you will be asked about. So in a certified aircraft, there's plenty of performance charts that they've all been thoroughly reviewed by the FAA, and there's methods to determine performance for given conditions. One of the major problems that I've found in the experimental aviation community, not just gyroplanes, but the experimental aviation community in general, is that depending on the aircraft you're flying, the data can be really unreliable. And also it benefits the manufacturer from a marketing standpoint to show the best performance possible in those performance charts. So we're going to go through in just a little bit other methods that you can use if you have or if you are just using some very generalized data that will help you on takeoff and landing performance. So back to my story about density altitude and how it caused me trouble. This is a picture of the gyroplane that I landed, so you can guess where or what the outcome was here. But before my trip up to Erie, Colorado, I had and still have a good friend that's he's also a gyroplane instructor. He is he was a Army Night Stalker with a special operations unit in the Army. And he had a ton of experience mountain flying and in high density altitude. And he warned me before I went on this trip. He said, Dayton, flying in those mountains and in high density altitude is nothing to mess around with. And I knew that he knew what he was talking about, and I absolutely should have heeded his warnings more closely. So on the day of this particular incident, I'd conducted a number of training flights out of Erie, and while the takeoff, roll, and climb were noticeably different than they are in Taylor, sorry, I got distracted by one of the chats. So while the takeoff and takeoff distance was noticeably different than it is in Taylor, it wasn't anything that I was unable to work with. So after a few flights, my student wanted to go fly around through some of the mountain passes, and I thought it would be fun, so I said, okay. Guys, this was my mistake. This is where the chain should have been broken. Without having any mountain flying training, short of my friend's warning, I really had no business flying in the mountains. We already experienced decreased performance due to the high density altitude while we were flying around the mountains. And then we were hit with a downdraft that turned our already anemic rate of climb into a fast descent. So we had nowhere to land except for on peak-to-peak highway in the mountains or in trees that were roughly 100 feet tall. You can see the trees next to the gyro in that picture. So a quick decision, excuse me, a quick decision to land on the highway saved our lives. Peak-to-peak highway is a 2-lane highway, so there wasn't much of an option to land with or against traffic. I know there's always an argument there about, do you land with it, do you land against it? That wasn't really an option in our case. We were landing in both. So we landed so hard, we did crack the main landing gear strut. You can't see it in this picture, but behind the wheels there was a crack in the landing gear strut. But we were fortunate that was all the damage that was done to the aircraft. When we landed, an oncoming car had to swerve out of our way and went under the still spinning rotor blade to avoid hitting us head on. It was absolutely a lesson learned the hard way that density altitude is no joke. And before flying in the mountains, a pilot should absolutely receive special training on areas to be cautious of. So if y'all are looking at flying into any mountain areas or mountainous areas, it is absolutely something you want to take seriously. So after landing, news of the event made it on some of the gyroplane forums, and some Colorado locals, they actually mentioned how fortunate I was to have survived. And they said that particular stretch of highway is littered with aircraft that didn't have the same outcome. So I give this seminar admitting my faults, and also letting y'all know this isn't something that is, oh, it won't happen to me kind of thing. It can absolutely do it, because I was of that mindset of, oh, I knew I had the performance, everything's good, and I didn't. So in fact, just this week when Jeremy advertised breaking the chain on Facebook, there was a comment from someone from Utah saying that when the weather starts to turn warm there, that's when the accidents really start happening. So it's if y'all are going to be doing any flying in high density altitude environments, please take that warning. Now, density altitude does not have to necessarily be at a high altitude, as we talked about. It could be just a high density of the air, even though you're at a lower altitude, because of the heat and pressure, or temperature and pressure. So I went over how density altitude got me in trouble. Let's talk a little bit about how it could get you in trouble. So most pilots know, or at least should know, that after talking on this seminar, the aircraft performance decreases with altitude. We could run through the performance charts of different aircraft to discuss these numbers, but I'm not going to bore y'all with that. Instead, I'm going to just give you a couple different scenarios given a sample aircraft. And this sample aircraft that I chose is a 1998 Cessna 172S. It was just a random aircraft that I chose and pulled the performance charts out of. So I want to give the first scenario. I know a lot of you are from Texas, and so I picked a couple of airports from Texas. This first one being, excuse me, Mustang Island. And I pulled the weather data. Well, on this one, I chose to do a 0 degree C at sea level, or 5 feet as Mustang Island is. You can see it on the sectional there. It's only 5 feet up, or 5 feet elevation. And I ran the performance numbers based on the chart here on the right. And the runway required just to take off, again, at 0 degrees C, which is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, runway required is 860 feet. And the clearance required, I'm sorry, the runway required is 860 feet. To clear a 50-foot obstacle is 1,465 feet. So the runway at Mustang Island is 3,500 feet long. So on this particular day, I would say you're probably not looking at too much of an issue there. Now, that being said, even though these numbers come out to where they are, I highly, highly, highly encourage you all to make a decision to increase your these numbers by some factor, whatever that factor is. Whether if you're a new pilot, you may want to increase it as much as 50%. If you're a higher time pilot, it may not have to be that much, but I highly encourage you all to add a safety factor, if you will, to each one of those numbers if you're calculating them. So second scenario. So this was yesterday, Austin Executive Airport. And Austin Executive Airport has a runway, a north-south runway that is only, let me see, it is 1,550 feet long. So the elevation, let's see, this, Jason, I love that comment. If you're not off the ground by mid-runway, don't keep trying to take off on the second half of the runway. Absolutely agree with that. I'm actually going to expand on that just a little bit more. So give me just a second. We'll get to that. So the second scenario is at Austin Executive Airport. Austin Executive has a runway that's north-south. It's 1,550 feet long. I took the weather from yesterday where it was 32 degrees Celsius. And the field elevation is 620 feet. The runway required is 1,147 feet. And the clearance required is 1,900, or to clear 50-foot obstacles, 1,946 feet. So what this is saying is that if the aircraft performs perfectly and everything's done right, then you are still not going to be 50 feet off the end of the runway when you clear the end of the runway. Some of y'all get into a lot of these high-performance aircraft and STOL aircraft, and so y'all are braver than I am. But it is something that doing these calculations can really help. And finally, in the third scenario, Erie, Colorado, this was also yesterday at the time I was putting these calculations together, 33 degrees Celsius. The runway required in a Cessna 172 would have been 1,815 feet, and the clearance required would be to clear a 50-foot obstacle is 3,080 feet. From the time your wheels break ground to the time you clear your 50-foot obstacle is going to be 1,265 feet. So you can see your climb rate is not good at all in those areas as well. So on these slides, I'm talking only about takeoff distance. I'm not talking about rate of climb. I'm not talking about any of the other performance charts, which are also all affected by density altitude. So I just didn't want to take all the time to go over everything. And Dortch, the next slide I have is actually going over that exact same thing that you just mentioned. So before I get to that slide, though, I want to I want to go over a couple of things that a lot of people have a tendency to miss. And if any of y'all are actually studying for your knowledge exam, these are the things that the FAA will put in there to confuse you, because the FAA will give you answers on the knowledge test that will say, how long does it take you to take off, 850 feet or 860 feet? If you're really making the decision based on 10 feet of runway, you're foolish in my opinion. But that's the way the FAA does their knowledge exams, and so something to think about. This is actually a very good point also, is the other issue is flying a twin at high density altitude. The engines won't perform like the pilot's operating handbook. And your options if you have an engine failure up there. I'm personally not a multi-engine pilot, so I'm not, I actually don't know that information about I know the gist of it, but I'm not that great of I'm not a multi-engine guy at the moment. So let's talk a little bit about what these charts show. First note here, short field takeoff distance is at 2550 pounds. This also is a short field technique. So in order to achieve these numbers, you have to be doing the technique exactly as described in the manual. So it is a short field takeoff distance. The conditions, your flaps have to be at 10 degrees, throttle, full throttle prior to brake release. It's a paved, level, dry runway. It is paved. This is zero wind, so obviously taking off into wind is going to help you, but that's one of the notes at the bottom as well. This assumes you lift off at 51 knots, and when you hit 50 feet, you're doing 56 knots. Here are the notes in the bottom. Short field technique as described in section 4. So if you're flying in marginal conditions, or even if you're not flying in marginal conditions, you really want to be up to date on your performance and the techniques as described in the manual. This also does say if you're flying at fields above 3,000 feet, and this is something I think Mike might have gone over last week with y'all, make sure that you lean the mixture so that you get the best performance. Then you do have a couple of options here or to decrease the distance with because it says decrease distance for 10% for every 10 knots of headwind, and increase this is actually an important note here. For operation with tailwinds up to 10 knots, increase distance by 10% for each 2 knots. So by the time you have a 10 knot tailwind, which it does sound like this manual would allow, you would have a 50% increase in your takeoff distance. So there are airports such as Aspen, I believe it is. Some of you in here probably have more experience flying in and out of these high DA airports regularly. I know that Aspen and a couple of the other ones require that you take off and land both going the same direction. So sometimes you have to take off with a tailwind at some of these airports, because otherwise you don't have the climb clearance to clear mountains otherwise. And then if you're taking off from grass runway, increase your distance 15% for the ground roll. So Jeremy just made a note and said the advantage of having high density altitude in a multi is that you do not get aggressive VMC characteristics like you would at sea level. On the flip side, the airplane may not be able to fly single engine and will drift down below single engine service ceiling, and that may not be a desirable situation in high terrain. Jeremy, thank you for following that up on because that is not my area of expertise, so thank you. So as I'm getting a lot of these chats, I'm following up with that also. Performance charts are typically going to show a best case scenario. Just like we talked about earlier, it definitely benefits the manufacturer to have the best performance in their manuals. So the numbers in performance charts are provided given a test pilot in a brand new aircraft with new compressions and clean flight surfaces. It's incredibly important that you keep this in mind and take into account that most likely, we probably do have a couple test pilots in here, but most likely you're not a test pilot. And the aircraft most likely is not a brand new aircraft. So always keep that in mind when you actually run these figures. So, and a very good point, Eric, as well. The grass that they talk about when they say operation on a dry grass runway, that's basically what they're talking about. There's a golf course. It's a well-mowed, dry grass. And Michael added, watch out for ground effect on rotation. You may get airborne before you're at a safe speed. Personal experience. And that's actually something I'm going to talk about as well here in just a moment. So, just 2 months ago, I had run performance numbers and I was in my Mooney. I knew that all was well within performance, and I was coming home from Meridian, Mississippi. I had my mom and my dad on board. It was a hot and humid day, and the density altitude was definitely higher than field elevation, but I was prepared for that. I knew my performance numbers are what they should be. Despite my preparedness, the plane did not want to climb very much. So the following week, when I dropped the plane off for its annual inspection, it turned out that 3 of the 4 cylinders had low compressions. So while this turned out to be uneventful, thank God, there were plenty of stories out there that don't have an outcome similar to mine. So do any of y'all, and a couple of you mentioned it already, do any of y'all use any special procedures that you go through regarding a go or no-go decision before you take off? See, I'm not seeing any answers in the chat for now, so I'll just go on with Gumps. Check max RPM. That's an excellent point when you do your run up or static RPM. 75% of takeoff by halfway, takeoff speed by halfway down the runway. Okay. I look at density altitude, compare climb rate to required. Excellent. Excellent points. So I like to teach the PAVE checklist. As I'm sure a lot of you went over this in ground school or in your training. The PAVE checklist stands for pilot, aircraft, environment, and external factors to make sure that everything adds up. So this doesn't have to be something that you write down. It can be something that you go through in your mind and use the PAVE checklist every time when you fly. This way you'll know of any uncertainties prior to beginning your flight. So as far as pilot, you can run the I'm safe checklist. I'm safe stands for illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue. And a lot of people say the E stands for different things. I say eating. So make sure you're well nourished. On the aircraft, make sure your pre-flight checks out. Everything is good. I'll answer a couple of these chats in just a second. On the environment, make sure en route weather as well as takeoff and landing performance is favorable for you. And as all of you are saying, I also like to choose a spot on the runway where if the performance is not where I need it, I abort. So a couple of you are saying that you agree with the 1,000-foot check. And you know, I saw a couple of you say if halfway down the runway you're not making if you're not off the ground, then abort. That's a good rule of thumb. Again, some of you may be operating off of shorter airfields, so have a point on the runway where you make your go or no-go decision. It may not necessarily be the halfway point. It may be further down the runway. It may be closer in on the runway, but pick a point somewhere on there. Let's see, about 2 years ago, I was departing from a 6,000-foot airport, and I leaned my carburetor to the best power. Immediately on climb out, my CHT was at 440. It scared me. Thought I had to abort. Stayed at 500 AGL to allow the CHTs to cool. Later, I learned that I leaned the engine to best power was actually bad for the engine as it was not getting enough fuel to cool itself. So which one should I do? Lean for best power or lean just a little bit, but keep it on the rich end? And Ranfurry, that's an excellent question. And it's one of these things. You've really got to do what works best for your aircraft in that situation, your situation. Mike Bush last week would have been the better person to ask about this. You really want to have max RPM for your best takeoff performance. Yet at the same time, I understand not wanting to cook your engine. When I had to replace my 3 cylinders, that was not the best day of my life. But it's, as far as the manual says, what I would say is go exactly by the POH. And yes, exactly. Jose mentioned the exact same thing. So the last item of the PAVE checklist is external factors. this is one of the biggest causes of accidents. For those of you that are CFIs, you've gone through this. External factors is absolutely one of the biggest causes of accidents out there. So is there anyone or anything pressing you to make the flight? And I'm not saying that if you do have an external factor, that's immediately a no-go, but you should absolutely not let that be something that's driving you to make the flight and or pushing you to make the flight. So I also know that this seems a little bit ridiculous to have to say, but if during run-up you notice that something's not right, don't fly the aircraft anyway, guys. It's far better to err on the side of caution. I'm familiar with more than one scenario where something seems slightly or significantly off in the run-up, and the pilot chose to fly anyway. So in the situations that I'm familiar with, the pilot was lucky enough to live through the incident, and there was an incident or actually an accident that followed. When talking with them afterwards, they admitted that something didn't seem right in run-up, but they chalked it up to inexperience or not thinking it was that big of a deal. Even if it's not that big of a deal, guys, bring the plane back, ask the mechanic, say, hey, how do I deal with this? Talk to others about it if you don't have the experience level in yet to know for sure whether or not it's okay or not. So let's see, we got a couple more. Lean for best power, density, altitude. If you enrich and then you're flooding the engine, and the 182, make sure it's made extra rich at full throttle. So, okay. So I wanted to include this picture here. By the way, all of these pictures are pictures from some adventures that I'll talk about here a little bit later that I've gone on in the gyroplane. But regarding external factors, the psychological aspect of flying is something to always take into consideration. Aside from general pre-flight checks where it's easy to convince yourself that, I thought the engine always had that roughness to it, or the fuel gauge has to be reading incorrectly. I'm pretty sure I checked the fuel quantity, and I'm relatively certain it was full. Make sure that besides those being external factors that psychologically you can kind of get yourself past, in high density altitude environments, it's easy to find yourself coming up on an obstacle that the aircraft doesn't seem it's going to clear as well. So in all of those situations, first off, in pre-flight, again, step back, or if you're not sure, ask others that might have more experience, and don't fly the aircraft if there's any uncertainty. In the high density altitude environment where you find yourself coming up on an obstacle that the aircraft doesn't seem it's going to clear, then always fly the aircraft to the manufacturer's recommendation. It's very, very easy to get yourself into a stall spin situation, or in the gyroplane, get into what's called a high rate of descent, where you get yourself behind the power curve. So I distinctly remember flying with a student on a hot summer day off of a grass field in Waco, Texas. Remember, high density altitude doesn't have to be at a physically high altitude. It just means the density of the air is making the aircraft perform as if it is at a high altitude. So the particular aircraft I was flying, the particular airfield I was flying was only 590 feet MSL, so pretty close to sea level. But the runway was also only 1,900 feet long, and it did have trees at the end. So on this hot day, my student saw the trees at the end of the runway coming up at him. This was a training flight. He saw the trees coming up at him, and he became nervous about approaching them. Just like in this picture, if you were flying at that mountain right there, you might get kind of nervous about approaching that mountain and decide you're going to start pulling back on the cyclic or on the yoke in most situations. So in this situation, I fought him from reducing the power after our go, no-go decision point as we were out of room to abort the takeoff. And I also fought him on pulling back on the cyclic to try to clear the trees prior to having enough airspeed to do so. So where this would stall an airplane, it will also slow, and a gyroplane won't stall. As I mentioned, it'll put you on the backside of the power curve. And either way, the ending's not good for either situation. So my comment on that is, when you commit to a takeoff, after you've passed your go point, stay committed to the takeoff and follow the performance procedures that are appropriate to the airplane. Similarly, if you decide to abort your takeoff prior to your go point, stay committed to your abort and follow the proper procedures. I had a student just this week decide to abort the takeoff, then they immediately applied full power. To someone's comment earlier, they said something similar. So once you've made your decision, stay committed to your decision. And as your instructor always said, fly the airplane. Always fly the airplane. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that that a lot of aircraft, older aircraft, may not have the performance charts such as you might see in the modern airplanes coming off of a Part 23 certification. So I know that very few of you are actually still carrying around the old E6B flight computer with you, and very few of you will actually take the time to crack open the manual every time you fly and look at the performance numbers every time you fly. But there's so many apps and devices that you can enter your performance data on, and they'll spit out what your performance should be given the current weather conditions. So I believe ForeFlight automatically spits out this information. I think Garmin Pilot does also. I believe WingX does. So basically, all of these electronic flight bags, or I shouldn't say all, but many of them do. With that said, I mentioned earlier that many experimental aircraft or even older certified aircraft just don't have performance charts that are very reliable to use. So my Mooney would be one of those. The performance charts are pretty anemic. So in these situations, you can use what's called a Koch chart, which is what I have here on your screen. There's a wonderful resource online that I use. It's called takeofflanding.com. And I would highly recommend it to anyone who just wants a quick look at how performance is going to be affected on a given day. So in this screen, or on this page, and by no means am I a representative of takeofflanding.com. It's just a tool that I've found that I really like. So all you have to do is go there, you type in the airport that you're at, it'll pull up the current METAR, it will give you the pressure altitude and the temperature, and it'll say in these conditions a runway of, and it gives you the longest runway at that airfield would be the equivalent to a sea level runway of whatever that runway length would be. So this was yesterday when I was putting all this together again. And so at Taylor's runway of 4,000 feet would actually be the equivalent of a runway that is 2,950 feet. So what does that mean to us? Well, you can look here on right here, and this will tell you that whatever your takeoff performance is on a standard day, add 36% distance to the takeoff and decrease your rate of climb 27%. So it's just a really, really good tool for those of you that don't have a really solid method of determining performance. Now, this chart does assume a standard airplane or a generic airplane, I should say, that is normally aspirated, so not turbocharged. So that will make a difference, but overall, it will give you a good indication of how your aircraft's going to be affected. So, Michael, that's a good question. Is that calculated at max weight? So typically the numbers that you get for performance that are given in the book are going to be at maximum gross weight. So what this is saying is just simply what percentage to add to that. It's not necessarily saying that what to take off for any difference in weight. Obviously, the less weight, the better the performance, but this is going to give you just what or how to increase the takeoff distance and how to decrease the rate of climb. So whether you manually calculate the performance numbers or you have some sort of electronic means to, if you're flying in and out of places that have unknown variables, reference your performance charts prior to your flight. That's really what this all comes down to. So this is how my failures led to my successes. So they say luck is where opportunity meets preparedness. And my unfortunate experiences of flying in high density altitude environments have provided countless opportunities in my aviation career. So after my experience in Erie, Colorado, I grew to respect the mountains and high altitudes more than I ever did before, that's for sure. I've had opportunities to ferry gyroplanes and airplanes all around the United States. And thanks to these experiences, my friend John Crepero and I were able to set 3 world records for speed over a recognized course in a gyroplane weighing less than 500 kilograms. These world records were from Dallas to Los Angeles to New York City, and New York City to Dallas. We absolutely wouldn't have been able to make the flight without the knowledge of how to navigate high terrain and the performance of the aircraft in those areas, both through my experience and John's help as well. Subsequently, my friends John, Mike, and I were able to, and those are two different Johns, we were able to be a part of the first VFR flight to Cuba in over 50 years, where we flew 2 gyroplanes from Austin, Texas to Havana, Cuba. On that flight, here, let me move that up a little. On that flight, we actually had to adjust who flew in which aircraft for performance off of a few short fields that were at high DA. So one of the aircraft that we had, actually the red one in the bottom left picture there, it has a turbocharger on it and the white one does not. So we adjusted for that based on our density altitude. So we also had to calculate performance for crossing the pond into Havana. We knew we were going to be facing about a 25-knot headwind going from Florida to Havana. And due to a misunderstanding between our handlers, we were actually departing from Marathon, Florida, rather than Key West. So we were having to fly west of Havana, or we were also having to fly west of Havana before we turned inbound, which added about 60 nautical miles to our trip. So we decided that when we left Marathon, Florida, that when we reached the ADIZ, and for those of you that don't fly internationally at all, that's the Air Defense Identification Zone. That's basically where you leave the United States. We needed to have at least 55 knots over the ground and 3/4 of a tank of fuel. When we reached the ADIZ, we had 56 knots over the ground and we were pegged on 3/4 of a tank of fuel. But again, because of proper planning, we knew the performance of the aircraft. We've had some amazing trips because of that. So in conclusion, there's really just a few takeaways I want to leave you with. Although I'm certain that this is the same thing you heard in flight training, I can tell you from firsthand experience that it's incredibly important. Know the expected performance of your aircraft by referencing the performance charts and tables, and then add a margin of safety that'll allow you to operate the aircraft comfortably and safely. Pay close attention to the notes in the aircraft performance charts. They're there for good reason and they can save your life. If the performance is marginal, don't tempt fate. Don't let anything stand in the way of your decision to cancel a flight or make a go or no-go decision. Takeoffs are optional, landings aren't. And in almost every accident, there are external factors that lead to them. Don't let anyone or any situation influence you to go when you feel it's unsafe to go. In fact, the friend of mine that I told you, it was the Night Stalkers pilot. He's a medevac pilot now. And he was telling us that they don't even tell them the mission of their flight anymore when they go on a flight, because they don't want a pilot making a decision to go on a flight because there was a child that was involved in an accident, or make the decision based on that, when instead they're really just transporting a gurney from one place to another. So they've stopped giving them that external factor. The aircraft's either safe to fly or it's not, and the external factors aren't going to change that. So once you've computed computed the performance on the aircraft and you choose to go, fly the aircraft the way the manufacturer recommends. Don't panic. And then if you're flying in the mountains, try to get some instruction from a local instructor who knows the mountainous area that you're flying. They'll be able to tell you about any odd weather phenomena that you may not be familiar with. Jack just asked a very good question about on the Rotax engines. How do you lean or enrich the mixture? That's actually done automatically. It's altitude compensating in the carburetor. So there's nothing that we can do to change on the Rotax engines. If any of y'all are flying those, light sport guys that are out there, there's really no way you can adjust the mixture on that. So the final point that I want to say to y'all is just be safe and have fun. So guys, thank you all for your time. I believe Paul's going to open it up to any questions that any of you may have. Yeah, I appreciate all of y'all coming in and sitting in.
All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. If your line does not unmute automatically, you may have to go and click unmute on there. So give me 1 second here. I'm going to unmute everybody.
Sounds great.
Okay, everybody should be unmuted, so all the shenanigans need to stop in the background. And feel free, your mic should be hot to ask Dayton any questions you want. Not all at one time now.
What'd you do with your Mooney after you had 3 cylinders with low compression?
So that's a good question. Actually, I looked on Spruce, and I could have gotten Millennium cylinders. I was looking at doing that. I could have gotten those for just under $4,000, which I decided to go on ahead and replace all 4 cylinders. But instead, my mechanic told me that I was better off sending it to Sal's cylinder repair. And I tell you, he from what I've heard, he does great work. I actually haven't gotten the Mooney back yet. I plan on getting it back September 1st. So it was, I haven't gotten it back yet.
Yeah, I replaced a cylinder and I have my old cylinder, don't know what to do with it, and it looks like it's repairable. It's just sitting in my hangar.
Definitely give Sal a call. He's just north of Dallas. I forget what the name of the city is that he's in, but it's from what everyone says, they swear by him. There's a couple other guys that can repair cylinders as well. He's just the only one that I'm familiar with.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you.
Eric, to answer your question, the Mooney is a C. It's a 1966 C model. I've got a Garmin 650 in it, and actually just used it to get my IFR rating, and we'll probably work on a couple more ratings in it.
Cool.
That
I'll have to convince you to come formation flying with us if we ever get to hold clinics again.
I would absolutely love to. I've got some friends that do it. Are y'all down in San Marcos?
Yep.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to join y'all for some of that. That'd be great.
Highly recommend the formation flying. It's fun.
I've just got to get the invitation. That's all I'm waiting on.
We'll let you know.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I did have one question, if I'm unmuted.
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So you had mentioned early in the presentation about accommodating for humidity, and they pretty much just gloss it over during my private pilot training. You know, they mention it that you should know that, you know, the higher the humidity, you know, the less dense the air is. But could you review again the calculation or how to accommodate for that and where?
Yeah. So again, it is kind of one of these things that is glossed over in almost everything that you read. Really, the problem is it becomes basically a calculus function to figure out exactly what
I can hear you
how
now.
humidity affects you. So really,
All right.
what the FAA's stance on it, at least in the articles that I've read from the FAA stance is simply if it's high humidity, add 10%. So, and what is high humidity? I couldn't tell you. I mean, any day in Texas, I would say is high humidity. But and this is the screen that shows that, but I've read multiple different things. There's actually about a 150-page article that Embry-Riddle put out that talks about, I mean, it talks about the number of grams per mole and all of this of dense air versus dry air. And so it gets into really complex equations. So in general, what the FAA stance is on it, according to their publication, is add 10%.
Okay.
How much
So
fuel did you
I'll
have
add a
left
little,
when you landed in Cuba?
Not that I'm seeing.
Oh, they're talking Dayton right now.
Yeah. So somebody was asking how much fuel we had left when we landed in Cuba. So one of the gyros had about 4 gallons of fuel left. And granted, we are burning 6 gallons an hour. So it's not like 4 gallons is running on fumes in the gyro. But we had 4 gallons in one of the gyros and we had 1.2 in the other one. So it sounds worse than it was. That gyro was actually put in a holding pattern by air traffic control. And finally, the pilots of that actually made a decision to declare minimum fuel. And they were able to make it in by declaring minimum fuel. Never had a low fuel light go off or anything like that. But it was much tighter than I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah.
So Dayton, do you have any rules of thumb? I cringe when I say that. For how much to add? So how much would you tell a new pilot to add? What percentage to the book calculations to keep themselves in a reasonably safe range?
You know, it's an excellent question, and what I've found as an instructor is, so I'm not an instructor in fixed wing. I'll put that on there, but as an instructor in gyroplanes, and I teach this same kind of information in gyroplanes. As a new pilot, I would say add 50% to whatever the book is saying. Not only is that, should that more than cover anything that you're going to experience, but the other side of that is anything that might go wrong from the engine, just so much as coughing, from, hey, maybe you forgot to put the mixture in the proper spot when you began, or from running up to taking the runway, maybe you forgot flaps. I mean, there's all kinds of things that students can do. So honestly, from a student perspective, 50% is where I would say. For me, I'm about a 400-hour fixed wing pilot, and so about 25% over what the book says is about what I'm comfortable with. Now, that said, I would really, if I'm looking at 25% more and I'm on a runway that's right at those numbers, I'm not going to be super comfortable with it, but that's about where my threshold is.
A technique I was taught a long time ago is I take takeoff roll and I take landing roll and add them together. And if it's not that or higher, I don't go.
That's an excellent point. That's a really good point.
That way I can accelerate the takeoff rotation and shut it down and stop it if I'm on my game.
Very good point.
I can give a little check ride gouge for any of the student pilots and or CFIs. If you're going to fly with Ken Whittington, one of Ken's favorite places, he always uses Abilene somewhere as far as doing computation for density altitude. And it's a pet rock for Greg Squires. You just better know everything there is to know about density altitude, what airspeed you fly, and you just kind of need to know that. And the last thing I would add is if you really want to see the effects of density altitude in flight, there's a YouTube video of a bird dog, an L-19, flying in the mountains, and the guys are trying to outclimb the terrain and they don't do it.
Yep.
And it's very tragic and very sad, and I don't think they found them for a year.
That was
But
the one
there
where
was
Ronnie was in the back seat, right? The old VHS tape.
Yeah, but
So-
it's
Yeah, I saw that one too.
An old friend of mine flies a Cessna 150 from Enid, Oklahoma up to Angel Fire. Does it year round. But he really, getting out of Angel Fire, he really makes sure there's a certain time of day he goes, temperature's got to be right, winds have got to be right, or he doesn't go. But he does the density altitude to make sure his plane fly. Now he has to fly around that valley a little bit to get through the passes in that 150. But he also takes off with very little fuel, just enough to get safely over the mountains. And but he does density altitude every time. He's been doing it for 30 years safely.
Well, that's the thing. In that situation also, it becomes something where you have to make sure that you fly it to the performance of the way the book is written in that situation. If you try to do a lot of these places where if you try to do a normal takeoff or use normal takeoff procedures, you may not get the performance that you need.
When I was up there, a guy at the Angel Fire FBO said that every month they have some guy, he said a Mooney, so you Mooney guys, said some guy in a Mooney comes out to the airport and loads his wife and his girlfriend and a kid and a chainsaw carving of an owl in the back of the plane. And about halfway down the runway gets it shut down and comes back and unloads it and unloads fuel and mails a bunch of stuff home. And he said it happens every month. He says every year somebody crashes up there because of density altitude.
Well, I could tell you another story. So I'm a pilot examiner as well, as I mentioned, and I don't know who iPad 212 is, but you made a very good point on the the examiners and how they have a tendency to really hit on that. I can tell you from personal experience, there's good reason for it. I actually almost had my pilot examiner rating, or I actually got under investigation by the feds once for, luckily during this particular exam, I had someone that was, or my POI actually supervised me go over all the performance data with my applicant. But this applicant passes his exam, and the ink was still wet on his sport pilot certificate, and he went up to Midland, Texas, on a hot summer day where the density altitude was well over 6,000 feet. He loads the sheriff of Midland, who was a grain-fed boy, and had the full belt on him with all of the sheriff's stuff on him, and ends up taking off, gets behind the power curve, and wrecks the plane with the sheriff of Midland on board, and my signature right on the bottom of his certificate. Thank God everyone lived through it. Everyone was okay. But that's the reason why these examiners are as hardcore about it as they are, because they've seen it.
Yeah, iPad 212. This is Mike Cavanaugh from the big city of Cuero, Texas. And we don't worry too, we're down here, and it's, if you fly out of Calhoun County or something like that, you got a romping, stomping, field elevation of 20 feet. And so we kind of live the good life down here. But if you start heading north, it's a different issue. And our DPEs, they take that stuff serious.
And they should.
There's a couple routes. Squires will send a guy from Yoakum or San Antonio. He'll send them out to the flight plan out to New Mexico to go skin diving in some big lake up there. And I mean, you can, the questions that'll grow from that are pretty amazing. But yeah, density altitude is serious business.
Absolutely. Well, are there any more questions or anything for?
If someone's got a PPL, fixed wing, how involved is it to add a gyroplane rating?
So that's a good question. So it depends on what level you want your gyroplane rating. Most people go for the sport rating, and in that situation, there's no hour requirement for the sport rating. However, it's probably going to take you somewhere around a minimum, I would say, around 10 hours. But the sport requires no hour requirement. But you have to fly with an instructor and fly to the standards, and then you have to take a proficiency check with the second instructor. So that's really what's required to add sport privileges. To go private, and then it's that's about 35 hours of flight time, unless if you're helicopter rated. If you're already helicopter rated, that's a different story.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Anybody else got any questions? Well, I will accept that silence as no. And for those of you who are asking about flying gyroplanes, it is absolutely awesome. Dayton, if you want to quit sharing your screen real quick, I'll go ahead and take it back. Unless you got anything else to add, Dayton.
That's all I've got, man. It's all yours.
All right. Awesome. Thank you, Dayton. Once again, thank you for your presentation tonight. I did my gyroplane training with Dayton and Scott about 2 years ago. And one of my favorite maneuvers is the vertical descent maneuver. And I actually got a video of Dayton and I doing that on YouTube at All American Aviation. And it's awesome because you're already in auto rotation and you pull the power back and you slow down and you just descend, and you can put a gyroplane on a postage stamp. Flying gyroplanes is really awesome. I really enjoy it. It's like the best that you can get from flying an airplane and a helicopter all in one. So I recommend those of you who are ever interested, go ahead and look up Dayton or someone in your local area who flies gyroplanes and take an intro flight, because you'll be blown away as to how cool it actually is. Everybody, if you would, go ahead and give Dayton a big round of applause in the chat, if you would. And I'll go ahead and close us out tonight. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay, so everybody, I just wanted to tell everybody thank you for joining in tonight. There is an email distribution that I push out updates on this program. It's a bi-weekly program. If any of you don't want to receive updates or get notified of upcoming presentations, by all means, let me know and I'll remove you from the list. I would like to encourage you all who participated tonight to go ahead and continue to come back for future webinars. This will be uploaded to YouTube, to the All American Aviation channel at a later date, and most likely between now and this Sunday. I gave out a code in the chat, 5310. Send that code to flyallamericans@gmail.com, and we'll get you wings credited for this event. Dayton, again, thank you for the presentation tonight. It was really awesome, and I can't wait to get back down there and go fly with you. We need to take the gyroplane into Bertram sometime. It'd be awesome. I'd like to invite everybody participating tonight to come back on September 8th at 7:30 p.m. For our next presentation, which will be aerobatics versus upset training with guest speaker Patty Wagstaff. Patty will be on 7:30 September 8th. I would encourage all of you to go ahead and return back for that presentation. And for those of you who participated tonight, again, thank you. Have a good night. We will talk to you in a couple of weeks. See you later.